welcome to MaRS. My name is Alison Hewitt. I'm the Senior Fellow here in Social Innovation and the Director of SIG at MaRS. SIG is Social Innovation Generation, national collaborative of 4 nodes across the country, including the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation in Montreal, the Plan Institute in Vancouver, and the University of Waterloo with Francis Wesley, and then MaRS. We've been doing some really interesting work with bringing very cool speakers from all over the place to MaRS to share their experiences with us. And most recently, some of you might have seen Zaid Hassan from Rio's Partners, his new book on the Solutions Revolution. Is that his book, or is that the other one? Social Lab Revolution. It's got social, it's got labs, it's got revolution. Put them all together in any combination you want. And he was really terrific. And then next week, a lot of us are going to be in Vancouver. Before we do that, we have a whole bunch of really wonderful lab leaders from all over the world, pulled here by Yuri van den Steenhoven, who is the director of the MaRS Solutions Lab, on what does it mean to actually operate a lab. So really hands-on folks. And one of those people is Dana Shen, who's the director of Family by Family. This is a unique lab-designed initiative where families who've been through tough times but have come out the other side or are coming out the other side, link up with families who really need support and who are keen to engage with folks, not in a social worker, I'm in need, you have the answers way, but how do we work together as peers and say, if I did it, you can do it, and how to get that kind of support. So it was designed by the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, or TAXI, as they call themselves. And Dana was, she's been in the director's role since September, so relatively new, but she's been very involved in this work. She was the director of, in public sector, in health services, child protection, policy and service management. And she's got a very interesting background. She's Aboriginal, Chinese, and a descendant of the Ngarrindjeri people, which I believe means people who belong to the land, is that in South Australia. She's got a passion for working with Aboriginal people and communities. So she was a community youth worker in South Australia, and she worked with Aboriginal folks there, and has also had executive level positions in government, particularly child services, running residential care services, all of that stuff. So it'd be really interesting to have a discussion with her about this transition from that world to this world. Dana's visit to Canada is part of a nationwide series of events that begins today, broadly called Social Innovation Canada 2014. Over the course of the next 10 days, events will take place in Windsor, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and culminate in a festival and community bonfire. How cool is that? In Vancouver. Am I going to that? Because that sounds really cool. I think that's cool. Yeah. So you can learn a lot more about this from sigeneration.ca. So I'm hoping you're going to check that out. I'm hoping you have that bookmarked. You see lots of cool stuff happening there. So to kick off the festivities and to put the spark in the fire, I'm going to ask you to join me in welcoming Dana Shen to MaRS. Dana, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It was really exciting to be able to travel over to Canada and to talk a bit about the work we've got going on in South Australia. Before I get started and start to get into the model and to talk you through the business of what we've designed in TAXI, firstly what I wanted to do was to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Huron people, the Haudenosaunee people, and the Mississauga people, just to pay my respects to the custodians of this land. So the presentation that I want to give today, I'm going to be touching on predominantly the Family by Family program, the opportunities and challenges that we can see in developing that and having worked with families on the ground and what we're learning from that. But just before that, I just want to very briefly touch on the work of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. So basically, similarly to what MaRS does, we have, and what it aims for, we are trying to make changes in the social sector. We're trying to do work that can challenge the toughest social problems. One of the things that we really would like to do is to not only have families get by or community get by, but that they actually thrive. So our aim is to aim a little bit higher for all of the community and the organisations that we work with. The TAXI strategy is focused on a number of different areas, which I'll touch on very briefly. We're now very much focused on going into the direction around certain population groups. That includes older people, families, and also Indigenous Australians. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in some of those areas. But also what we're trying to do is to build the capacity of the general community to understand innovation. How is it that they can use and learn that and apply it to the way that they want to work? How can they use those sorts of approaches to look at something differently in the way that they do work? And also we want to look at bigger organisations. So what can we do for the big public sector and other organisations to make broader social changes? So all of those are goals that we have in Taxi, but the one I'll focus on in particular is family by family, the model, the solution that we developed in order to respond to families that were being affected by state intervention. So if I can summarise what I just said, we are here to develop solutions and to spread those solutions. That includes family by family, and where we can, we want to help people and organisations to make broad social change. So I'll be touching on in detail about the family by family model. What I'll be doing with you around that is first of all talking a bit about what it is, where it comes from, and how it was developed, and some of the things that we're thinking about in relation to scaling the model. Later on, I want to talk a bit more about broader systems change. But before I do that, I just wanted to touch on the other solution that we've just recently developed and begun to implement. So Weavers is a second solution that's been developed by Taxi. And basically its aim is to work with older people who are carers and who have gone through the caring experience with somebody. So basically, similarly to the family by family model, as you'll find when I begin to talk about it a bit more, it's a peer-to-peer support model based on getting people together that have experienced the same thing and supporting each other. So in learning a bit about this particular model, we began to understand how carers needed the support from others because they become isolated in those situations. Also that they find it very difficult to navigate the systems. And you know, if any of us, I mean, I don't know how many people work in public sector or health or etc. here, even if you're well educated and work as part of the system, it's still incredibly difficult to navigate when you're personally affected by it. So part of what Weavers does is provide carers that actually work together. So that's one of the other solutions. If you have any questions about that, I can take that on. Basically, they're matching carers with carers that need support right now, and they're hoping to have, they've got 7 Weavers on board right now. They're called Weavers, the support people. Okay, so that's one of the solutions that we're dealing with, but now I want to talk a bit more in depth about the family by family model. So essentially, in 2010, Taxi, the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, asked the state government, what do you want us to focus on? What is your biggest social problem, big complex issue that you'd want us to deal with? And the issue that came through was child protection. I do understand that your statistics are similar to ours. You've got a high number of, for example, Indigenous children in care. You've got growing numbers of children in care, etc. For us, we've also got quite a big issue around family-based care, in that we can't get enough foster carers to take on people. Also, currently in different jurisdictions within Australia, though it's beginning to change, we don't actually do adoption on a major level. So a lot of the focus is trying to maintain children in the care with their families, and if not in family-based care, and if not in residential care, or what you would call here group homes. So that was the service that I ran. We've got very, very high levels of that occurring in a number of states as well. So all of these problems led to the government saying, look, can you tackle this first? Can you have a look at this? So the solution that we looked at is the family by family model, a peer-to-peer solution. And as Alison was explaining, it's about families that get together, that have been through tough times, helping others. Before I get into anything more further, I thought you would be interested in actually hearing from the families about how the model works. So I'm going to play a film first explaining that.
Family by family is one of the most inspiring approaches to assisting very vulnerable families, families going through a tough time, that I've come across in 4 decades.
Family by Family is a network of families connecting with other families. One family have been through tough times and helping another family that are going through tough times.
They have different bubbles, which are what they want to change about their family, and they come together and experience different situations in which those bubbles can be achieved.
Lots of people are in that bit where they're trying to get through it and they can't get out the other side, so you can kind of go, you know what, I did this, I've been here, I've done that. I can actually get out. I can help you get out the other side. It can be done. It's not a completely hopeless situation. And I think that's mostly what sharing families have to offer, I think, is just themselves and their stories and their life.
Hi, I'm Linda.
Hi, I'm Brady.
I'm Adrian.
And this is Lucas with the youngest one, Talia, and we're seeking family from Playford.
When we met Linda and her family, they were going through a really hard time. They were at risk of having their family separated by having the children removed from the home.
27 notifications in the last 3 years before this year.
What we saw was a very sad, depressed family. There was a lot of confusion happening.
They wanted to take the kids till they were 18. I went through court for 3 months.
How can we help with this? Because we're just as dysfunctional as the next family. But then we realised that we'd actually learnt a lot of things that we could really help Linda with.
Rochelle and David have just coaxed me along and got me to come out my shell, I guess.
It's strange seeing your mum do these things that you've never thought she'd even try and
It's
do.
just been fantastic to go through court, having the support behind me and not losing my kids. I'm looking at a happier future with my kids. I feel really proud of myself now that my kids are happier. I'm a lot happier and able to do a lot more with them.
I'm Sue. I'm a seeking family. I'm a single parent with 4 children. My 9-year-old son has some special needs. He was too young for it to be labelled, so it got labelled as developmental delays, which is an umbrella thing. Yeah. Since then, I've been knocking on doors and you know, screaming and crying and whatever for help.
We have guest speakers giving us training, for example, from Autism SA. That was particularly significant with Sue because I was able to pass on that information.
Sorry, I'm getting sad because that's the kind of thing that family actually does, you know, when someone's sick or they're going to have an assessment for a disability. You know, the family ring up and see how the outcome is, or someone meets you there, and that's never happened for myself and my children.
Instead of me telling me, no, I'm useless, I'm this, that and the other, I've got someone saying, no, you are a good mum, you do a good job, you know. So it's just, yeah, that helps immensely.
Just seeing her come alive, the way that she holds herself compared to the way that she did when I first met her is just, yeah. She actually, you know, stands tall and smiles.
Now, life is it's just going to get better. It's as good as it can get for me at the moment, I believe, you know.
My goals that we're working on at the moment are getting out more.
I'm getting to know her and not having her feel as though I'm a worker, I'm a friend, and I feel I am her friend now.
Jessie was afraid of leaving the house, afraid of connecting to other parents because she had a child in care, and she thought that people would judge her.
I think she helped me just by watching her. She's a good role model to be around, and that's just left tread marks on me.
She has just come so far in such a short amount of time, and her own reflection of what's happened for her and what's changed for her has been really inspiring.
I think it was mostly because of my self-confidence. I didn't have any. And I feel like when I'm out doing stuff by myself, sometimes I might feel alone, and like people are looking at me and thinking that I'm stupid, but I'm not. I'm just having fun with my son.
So why invest? Because you get value for money. The families are the change makers and the professionals are in the background, which basically means when you scale, it's cost effective.
You should invest in Family by Family because this program actually works.
It works.
Works. It works.
It works.
It clearly works.
It's giving us hope of a new way of reaching out to troubled families, drawing on the strengths that exist in other families.
So that's our program, Family by Family, and some of the initial families that have been a part of it. So I just wanted to kind of touch on a couple of things which come through. Like I've watched that a number of times now, but the things that really strike me about that is a couple of things. First of all, one of the biggest things that face a lot of families, particularly that end up with state intervention, is actually social isolation. Loneliness seems to play a big part of that. So part of what the model is trying to do is to build that community connection. Also, I just wanted to go through some of the language that was used there. So one of the mums actually mentioned notifications. So that's a South Australian term for reports that are made to our child abuse report line. And it means what she's saying is that there were so many of them, she actually got picked up in the child protection system. So just to touch on a bit about how the model was spoken about there and to explain it again. So first of all, you heard from sharing families. So sharing families are families that have been through tough times and they've come out the other end. And a couple of these families that were on here have been through some really tough times, particularly things like domestic violence has played a really big factor in some of the families involved in this. We also have families that have become sharing families that have been involved with the child protection system as well and did in fact at times have their children removed. So they have had some major issues in their lives and they've got through it and they're thriving and they're willing to share with somebody else. That's why we call them sharing families. We also have what we call seeking families. Seeking families are those that are going through tough times and are wanting some support to change. They're wanting to seek change in their lives, and that's why we call them seeking families. We link them up in this circle here, which is called a link up, and that is a connection that we make between those families. And the way it looks is basically that families get together for at least 3 hours a week. The sharing families are volunteers, and they spend time together on the change that they want to make. And as I sort of deep dive into the model, I'll talk to you a bit more in detail about what that looks like, but essentially that's the way the model works. We work with families from anywhere from 10 to 30 weeks, depending on the complexity of the change that they want to make. So if I can give one example, so if you're looking at about 10 weeks, often migrant families fit into that. So they're families that are doing okay, but they've come to a new place, they're not quite used to the new world that they're in, they need a bit of support and connection. So a sharing family will actually assist them to connect with other people in the community, to understand the right bus to take, those sorts of things. When you're looking at the 30-week connections or link-ups that we have between sharing and seeking, that's when you're looking at a far more highly complex issues. So it could be things like the reunification of a child with their family, or it could even be families that are particularly at risk of losing children, so which we've also done some work with. So that's the kind of the broad scale of the work, and I'll be talking more about this, but we have a professional in the background called a family coach, which holds these families and supports them through the actual link up and the time that they spend together to achieve change. So I'll come to that, but first of all, what I'd like to do is to take you through the process of how we developed this in the first place. So basically, we went through 5 key steps, and I'm going to give you some examples of some of the things that we've done about that. In developing this, we applied social innovation practice that was developed and has been also learnt from a lot of others, brought in together to apply to develop this model by Taxi. First one is ethnography. So people may have heard that if you've studied social anthropology, if you've looked at anything about the study of people, ethnography is actually spending time with people, is another way to say it. So in developing this model, the first thing that we did was we spent time with families. If they're the ones that we want to create something for, if they're the ones that we want to work with, they're the ones that we want to spend time with. And what we do is it takes the whole process of consultation to another deeper level. We actually want to walk nearly in the shoes of the lives of people. So if I can give one example, In developing one of our programs and our reports, one of our designers actually spent time with an Aboriginal family and actually walked around with her all day and wanted to really deeply understand what is her experience of life. What does it mean? Why is life hard for her sometimes? And it's hard to make connections, which is what she had said. And so what the designer did was walked around with her all day. And what we found was that not only did she have to go to a clinic because she was actually in drug rehabilitation, but she also had two children, one of which she had to get to school and get back early. He wasn't able, because of behaviour issues, wasn't able to stay there for the full time. She also had to drop another child off to childcare and basically spent the whole day going from those 3 sites. And at the same time, her own family were on the phone asking her for things the whole day. And so the designer walked alongside this person and just observed and experienced what that was like. That was why it was so hard for her to get anywhere beyond just getting her head above water, because she spent most of her life walking around, not being able to do much else. So that's ethnography. That's actually spending time with people, being in the shoes of the human beings you want to work with. The second step is co-design. And that is actually spending time with the people that you want to work with and designing the things with them. So a lot of us, are there many people that actually work in government or public sector or in direct service delivery? Do we have any people that have been involved in that? A lot of us don't have the time to be able to do this kind of work. You know, you're often got a lot of pressure on you to deliver services for what are called essential mandatory services, etc. Where we can, the ability to be able to test these things directly with families is actually going to improve our success in making something work. So both in the tools that we have developed for family by family, but also in the interactions that we have. So what's so interesting about the social innovation space is that every step is actually looked at in detail. So even the step where a family coach or whatever, you know, the person that sits in front of the family, even the what we say and how we do it went through a process of design, not just the products that we came up with in the end. So every interaction went through that process as well of design with families. And if they didn't like it, we'd put it aside and start again. So it's applying sort of more of the design principles that you'd use in designing products and, you know, vacuum cleaners, etc. And it's applying it to what it might mean in the social context for families. So that's what we call co-design. Then after that, you've come up with some product, it seems to be really, really good, interactions that families actually relate to. What do you do next? Well, then it's about prototyping practice. So you go through a process of actually testing it with families in front of them. So you test the interactions, you test the tools, and you're running it with them. And as you go through that process, you actually change and adapt what you're doing. And so that's called prototyping, and you do it quite rapidly. I love this particularly because most of my experiences in public sector work, and when we actually piloted something, we actually had to do it for a really long time. So you basically ran something for at least a year before, and then and near the end of it, you sort of wondered whether it worked or not. What was difficult about that is that you couldn't actually adjust at the time, and what you found was a lot of people on the ground would just begin adjusting it, because they wanted to do what was best for the client in front of them, not what was best for the bigger picture. So it happened, but you didn't do it on a wider scale. It's actually built into the system of design, which is really amazing in terms of how you make it better for people on the ground. A fourth thing was also around prototyping metrics, and this was one of the hardest parts of the design journey. How do you come up with a way to measure the change that you're creating with somebody, a family, whoever that you're working with, that they actually relate to, that they actually can use themselves, and that's not something that's built for the system? So we actually spent quite a lot of time working on metrics, and this is the one that actually there was a lot of iterations of this, a lot of testing, a lot of bits that got thrown out. And what we've come up with in the end is a really simple system where you are using a form of assessment. If you want to use that kind of clinical terminology, there's assessment, there's critical analysis of the information that you're gathering, etc. but you're actually doing it in a way that actually means something to the families, and in fact they can interact with it. So I'll show you a couple of screens from that to give you a picture of what families actually see when they play with our iPad app to show us what they'd like to change in their lives. And finally, for us, we had to develop a business model. So basically we had to develop the case for why we would actually receive funding. And for us in particular, a lot of South Australian funding, and I'll talk about this a bit more, and Australian funding is public sector funding. So basically we had to develop a case for the government in order to actually run the program, of which we successfully did. So that's really the broad process. So if I was to summarise, the basic co-design approach of Taxi, it is naming your hunches. So we did some ethnography, we spent some time with people, we come back into the office, you can have a sense of, you're guessing, you're doing some educated guessing, you're naming your hunches, and then what you do in this process is you go out and run it with the people that you actually want to work with. That fundamentally is the design process that we apply. So what were the steps that we took to actually develop this? So basically in 2010 we started the developmental stage. There were 3 stages that we went through, and each one of them we've had to do something slightly different because of where we had to go to next. This was really all of the things that I've just spoken about, basically building it from the ground up with the people that we work with, and applying those approaches with families in order to see that whether it works or not, and then adjusting those. So that was really the developmental stage. And we had what we refer to as a family coach. We had one at the time. At that time, as Alison mentioned, I was actually still in the public sector, and I actually supported the secondment of the social worker, Carolyn Curtis, over into that program to do this work. So they did it with a social worker, with designers together, which is great. You needed that shared multi-D approach to understand this type of work. Then we went through a demonstrate phase, and that's when Carolyn Curtis became the director of the program. Really, this was an opportunity to begin to build the evidence. So in 2011, we applied our first evaluation. Very, very initial evaluation, but a useful one that told us a bit about what we were doing well and who we were actually targeting. So out of the 66 seeking families, so the people that required support that we were able to get data from, we found that 90% of those families achieved their goals that they had wanted out of that program. So we're thinking, okay, we're onto something here, we're noticing something working here with families. So that was very useful. This was also an opportunity to start to build the systems and the fundamental infrastructure of the program. One piece being how you reimburse sharing families. So in fact, we do that. We reimburse them for their time to get involved with training and coaching, which I'll talk a bit more later. They volunteer their time to spend with families. And actually what we find is they volunteer a lot more than we ask them to do. Sometimes we've got to hold them back because really it's 3 hours. They actually go out of their way to spend a lot of time with families. So there's a lot of giving a lot of sharing and giving that they provide. We're now in what we would call the distribute stage, and this is where we are really thinking about how we scale the program. Later on, I want to talk a bit more about how we can use family by family as a lever to make changes in the broader system, just to touch on that, what we're thinking about. But first of all, I just want to talk about the scaling and growth of the model, of the actual program. So now we actually have, from one coach that started in 2010, we now have 6 coaches, and we've gone in South Australia with 4 coaches, and now we've actually gone to Western Sydney, so the east coast of Australia. And we're learning a lot from that as we begin to do this, and we're thinking a lot about the future of where we're going to take it. So I thought it would be useful to understand some of the considerations that we've got in doing that. So one of the biggest considerations for us as a lab providing a direct social service is who is it going to provide it in the future? Is it going to be us, or is it going to be somebody else? Is it going to be a not-for-profit? Whichever direction you go into, because we're piloting at the moment, there are pros and cons. The pros of actually running it ourselves is that you have an understanding of innovation and adaptation, a deep understanding of the model, and you can apply that with a congruence wherever you go. A similarity, a similar way of doing it wherever you go. And we're certainly practicing that in our new site interstate. The downer of that, and the hard part about that, is how do you scale it quick enough to be able to do that? It's actually quite challenging to run a direct service and to scale it in a big way. So that's one big thing that we're thinking about. The con of that is actually understanding that if we want to do it through a not-for-profit, how do we do it in a way where we understand the values of that agency? And how do we do it in a way where innovation and adaptation is still built into the system? How do you get that buy-in to be able to do that? So that's just one of the things that we're thinking about as we scale and grow. Related to that, but a little bit different as well, is how do we maintain quality of the actual product as we scale? And we're thinking about two things when we think about quality. The first one is about when we are to apply it through another agency, or even ourselves as we work through sustaining the model and thinking about our funding and business model for the program. In very tight times, my experiences, and maybe people that are in this room would have this experience too, models can be having their funding cut or reduced, and that can fundamentally change what people can do with that model. So you can come in with a certain theory of change. You can come in with a way of working that the evidence has actually demonstrated is actually positive, but if you take away certain components of that, you will fundamentally change what you're achieving. And so that, I think, is a big risk for anything that you do in terms of delivering services. So if I can give an example, Australia in particular is going through tight times, particularly South Australia. You may have heard that Holden is closing down, and that's having a big impact on South Australia. But also the federal government are really tightening purse strings and beginning to cut a range of different services. That has an impact on what people do. So for example, if I can this is just hypothetical, but what if we started to think about how we would cut sharing family payments? What impact would that have on involving families? I think it could have an impact. We don't know that, but that could be a risk. We take people through training and supervision for 3 hours a week, which I'll come to in a bit more detail later. What if part of it was cutting the time we actually spent with families? What would that mean about holding the risk, holding the practice of those families with working with one another if you begin to do that? So it affects directly the quality of what you're doing and therefore the theory of change. So we're trying to put it, that's one big issue that we're trying to look at and prepare for and to think about as we begin to scale. The second one is about generally quality of practice. How do you maintain that as you're doing it on a day-to-day level, particularly when you've begun to do it over a long period of time? And so what we are trying to do is to build systems in place, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that, which are going to try to maintain the quality of the work that we do over time and the consistency of the work that we do. So one of the examples that I actually want to give is what's called scoping. So what we've already done is we've scoped what we call two different areas. Scoping is our word for understanding a community. And what we've decided to do is that wherever we scale and deliver the service, we will understand the community beforehand in detail. We call that scoping. So similarly, like the design process that I mentioned before, it's about living in the shoes of the people that you're working with. So what we do is we actually go out into community and we spend time with families. We recruit them at barbecues and shopping centres and get their permission to spend time with them, a half a day or a dinner with them, and work out what does life mean for you in this community. What does it mean in Playford? That's in North Adelaide metropolitan area. What did it mean in Mount Druitt in Western Sydney? And what we do with that information is we adapt it to the model and say, okay, given this, what are the slight tweaks and changes that we can make that can better make this a localised program? So this can be anywhere from 2 to 4 to 6 weeks that we've done this work. And really it's about just understanding both the service sector and the system, but also the families that live in there. What does it mean to be living in a bad area? What is life like when you can't get a job there? Where do you go to when you need help? All of those questions. And so then we begin to adapt our model. So if I can give an example, in Playford and Adelaide, the technical college system is very strong. So it's used by many, many families because of wanting to gain employment. What we found through understanding the service system in Mount Druitt was that it was even stronger. It's actually one of the central points in Mount Druitt is what we call our TAFE system, which is your technical college system. And in fact, what we found is that most of the families that we work with who decide to be sharing families, and some of the ones that are our seeking families in Mount Druitt, are all connected with TAFE. So what we've done is we've adapted our recruitment process specifically to go to technical colleges to attract people, and we're thinking about and wanting to test what it might mean to build a service where we might be able to give people some kind of educational credit for being part of what we do, because it's such a central component of people's lives. So that's just one example, but a lot of things that we learnt from families and systems we begin to adapt and use in the models that we apply. So that's one way that we begin to apply the model in a consistent fashion, adapt it slightly without actually making major changes to the theory of change of the model. I just want to introduce two systems that we're using as well that give you a bit of a sense of how we want to maintain day-to-day practice. So the first one is called the Family by Family Runbook. For those that work in the system, this is basically a professional guidance and also a procedure manual. So it's basically a day-to-day operations. What do you do? How do you do it? And a bit more about why you do it as well. So that's one product that we're applying to ensure consistency of practice, whether it's in Adelaide or in Western Sydney at the moment. This is actually the family by family application, and I do want to spend a little tiny bit of time on here because it is the main thing that measures change for us. So basically what you can see up here is you see a set of bubbles. You may remember that Anastasia in the video mentioned the use of bubbles. This is our primary methodology for understanding what families want to change and measuring how they change it over time. So the central bubble on the left-hand side where it says tap to add a goal is the central bubble of change. So that is, what is the main goal that you want to achieve? That can be anything from, I don't want to be lonely anymore, I want more friends. And in fact, as a coach, I took over a coach role for about 3 months for a range of different reasons, but a great opportunity as well. And one of them was social isolation. So she had been in Adelaide for about 12 months and had not been able to make any friends. And because of her own fear of big spaces, wasn't even able to walk into her child's school. So that was just one thing, one goal. She wanted to change that. The top three bubbles at the top are really, what are the things that you will do to make that change? So for her, one of the biggest things was she couldn't even walk into Westfield. So I don't know if you've got Westfields here, but basically it's a really, really big supermarket with David Jones and all of the big Myer and all of those big things in there. She wasn't able to walk in there herself. So that was one thing that she was going to do as one of those things that could make a change to what her bigger goal. And then finally, the bottom three bubbles are actually looking at what is it that you want to see as your end point. What are the three things that you want to see change? And for her, one of those things was actually being able to have friends, actually being able to create her own social networks in the environment that she lived in. And then what we have in the next picture is you can see some little faces. This is what we call a thermometer. And what we do is we measure at key points, which I'll explain in a bit more detail in a second, how people are going. But we measure it up front. Where are you at with that particular situation? So in other words, in terms of going into big places or scary places, what are the things that have you done anything about that yet? We found with her that she had a pretty sad face. It was down at the terrible end. So a number of the goals are often down that end, and what we do is at certain periods of time, we actually look at reviewing that and seeing how they incrementally increase over time. And for the most part, it's quite positive. Finally, we have a range of questionnaires that we ask families. All of this we can do with interacting with the families in front of them. And often they can tap the circles or they can type things in the bubbles or whatever. So it's actually being able to use the change methodology, the measurement methodology in a way that people can make really easy sense of. It's quite simple to understand. And as Alison pointed out to me earlier, which is I think a good point, really, really good, particularly around literacy levels. You don't need to be able to read a lot to be able to do this, which is really useful as well. So what are some of the challenges, I think, and opportunities of being in a lab, the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, and also trying to run a direct service at the same time? As someone that's come from the public sector, and the reason why I was brought in is because I'd run services before and actually directed those before. I had a wonderful opportunity to actually come over to something that was very, very different. Not only was it not like any other service I've been in, it's not a normal not-for-profit, which is often a mini version and a mini bureaucracy of the big system that I worked in, but it was actually fundamentally based on designing things that are effective and efficient and better for people on a regular basis. So that's an amazing thing to be in and a great opportunity. The things that where there are a little bit more challenges are a couple of things. First of all, the framework and the structures that you require in an operational service, as in running things for people that work with other people around care situation and social services, can be quite different. So things like client management systems don't exist in the same way, obviously, in an innovation hub. So we're having to develop those things. So that's kind of a thing that's a bit different. And things like, you know, things like human resource management is different when you're working with people that are either a group of volunteers and supporters of a program working with other families, or with people that basically have social work backgrounds. Is quite different to multi-D teams and not having to do direct contact work all the time with families. Also, the methodology and the way you think can be quite different between the two. With the thinking, though the skills and the knowledge can be transferable, what you are focused on and the skill set required to do the work is quite different. So, for example, both areas, whether it's, you know, a business looking at innovation, developing their business models, etc., or a service, do think about risk. You know, you think about risk in different ways, about, you know, innovation, what's the risk of this not working, etc. But what we think about on a daily basis is operational risk. And a lot of that is about how you create safety for the children, young people and families that you're working with. So the skill set and the knowledge you require to do that is really different. And it takes experience to be able to do those things. So that's probably, I think, a good example of some of the differences that are needed. Having said all of that, what is most wonderful about it is because the thinking is so different. And I think one of the biggest opportunities I've learnt from being both in policy, in operations in the public sector and now into taxi, is that we have the ability to bring together what is often a gulf between policy development and direct service delivery. So if people here have ever worked in both, what you actually find is that the distance, depending on which kind of department you work in and how big it is, can be really far apart. So I worked in policy in one very, very big organisation in the public sector. And so my principal aim was to make changes to guide the direction of what people were doing. And I didn't always understand why the people that I worked with that were on the ground didn't understand that. And in fact, sometimes they didn't care about that either, and often told you that as well. So I was on that side. And then what I was able to, then I moved over into direct service delivery, and I was the one that didn't care about what people wanted, because what you're working with was the direct day-to-day. You know, these people are going, oh, we want to do this and we want to be big picture and we want to make major changes. Well, hang on, this child is in this house, they're going crazy. How am I going to do that? How am I going to make those workers do that with that child? So what is beautiful about working in an agency like Taxi is that we are intimately meshed. So when there are issues and there are problems, I go to the design team and go, this isn't working. Can you help us to readapt what we are doing? Can we co-design again what we're learning here? We need to do this differently. And because we've been running for a while and testing different things, we are hitting things that we are going to have to redesign again. So one example is, how do you recruit much bigger numbers of families? So for every single coach, we have 15 families. In our South Australian model, we want to double that. So we want to be able to get to 60 families by the end of this calendar year. We are going to need a different way of doing things. Now, I can run it over and over again the same way, and in fact, in the past, that's probably how I would have done it. I would have just gone, well, we'll just use the same methodology and try to get more. But what I've done is I've gone to the design team and said, actually, let's change the way, let's rethink what we can do here. So what we've basically done is we've brought together policy and operations much more closely, and we've got a very, very strong innovation component in there where we can readapt what we do. So I think that's probably one of the most amazing things in doing a lab and a social service together. I just wanted to touch on very briefly about working with public sector and what it means to be outside of that and doing it. So I have spoken a bit about some of the differences, at least my experiences of being in both. In South Australia and in Australia, a lot of funding comes from government. So that means that you're contracted to do things in a certain way. That means there are constraints and limits to what you can and can't do. Now, part of that is, and to be able to get that funding is to be able to do those things. But we are also asked to be able to be flexible and to also take things a little bit further, which is often why public sector will fund the non-government sector to do these programs, because for many reasons they're not able to run those programs themselves, for a lot of reasons. So that's, I think, a unique aspect of that relationship. Also, what I think is really important is that within the public sector, there are people that really do want to make changes in there. There are people that, despite the things that they have to do, despite sometimes the way the media works, particularly in areas like child protection, in other words, what it will do is it will end you to be risk averse because of the fear of something going wrong. Because of funding cuts and incremental changes to the way in which, and restructures that go over and over again, all of those things can affect what people do within the public sector. And so what we can do is provide an opportunity for them to see something a bit different. And I think that's a unique thing that we can do to provide a lot of what their vision is, a lot of what they can't always practice in a setting with the community and families as well. So I think that's a unique aspect about working both inside and outside of the system. And what I've found in being in both is that we actually have to walk both of those lines together. Because if we can't do that, we cannot necessarily get public sector contracts. If the public sector can't work with us, we can't be flexible in the way we do things. So very briefly, a quick example, we've had legislative changes which mean that we have to do really, really detailed criminal history assessments of sharing families, so our volunteers. This can be really tricky because, as I said earlier, the families that we bring in have been through tough times. So they've probably got some kind of background. That's normal for a family that's had a tough time. So one of the fears that we had was, what if sharing families that we currently work with didn't get through? What do we do then? What the Families SA did, the Child Protection Agency, which was fantastic, was that apart from the fact that we could have families that may not be assessed as being able to work with our families and seeking families, it was also taking quite a long time because of the numbers of people that were needing to get screened. You can imagine the amount of volunteers. So basically sporting institutions, etc., everybody has had to get screening assessments within South Australia. So what they did was that they did an initial assessment for us, and we were allowed to still have around child protection assessment. They did that for us on their system, and we were still allowed to have families working. So we brought to their attention that we've got families that have got backgrounds. If you don't help us to do this now, we're not going to be able to provide the support for current link-ups and seeking families that they're working with. So the public sector found a way around that in order to assist us. So I think that's one way that they came to us and were trying to support us in a system that can be very, very tight sometimes. So a useful way about working in and out of a system and together. Alison, I'm wondering, I wondered whether, in terms of timing, how much time I've got, and I'll just modify that, what I'm doing based on that.
So it's about 25 after 6, and we've got until 7 o'clock.
Great.
Leave some time for questions.
Beautiful. Okay, I've got some time. All right, now what I want to do, so that's kind of like the bigger picture, Now what I want to do is sort of deep dive into the details of the model. And what I would like to do is to take you through 4 key areas in order to explain that. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about family engagement. The reason I want to focus on that is because we do it pretty well within our program, and we do it in ways that are uniquely creative, which a lot of systems don't. And in fact, a lot of programs find it really, really difficult to engage families, so I want to focus on that. I want to talk about the professional that sits in the background. So we have sharing and seeking that spend the bulk of the time together, but we hold them as professionals in the background, and we hold their work together. So I want to talk a bit about that role and how they're involved. Part of the program that we have is that we want it to be whole family. So it's not just about the adults in a family, it's also about the children in the family. They can make a difference in the change process, and they do all the time. Anyone that has children here would know that children can make a massive amount of difference to adults and other children. So we are looking into and developing more how we think children can help with behaviour change. So I want to talk a bit about that, and finally to talk a little bit about Indigenous Australians and what we're doing. So family engagement. We do this in a massive way in different levels. right from the start when we engage families, we try to do it as creatively as possible without using just the stereotypical ways of engagement. So often what can happen in services is you have direct referrals from other services. That's mainly the way that you do it. We do it in a big way where we actually go out and meet people. So similarly that I mentioned in scoping, we actually go to local shopping centres and we hang out there. We actually do something that's attractive to families and we talk to them about the model that we've got. And that seems to work. So there are certain families that will find that a hard sell and they'll go, whoa, you know, get away from me, I'm not interested. But mostly families are actually really interested in talking to someone that's interested in them. And when you're not trying to sell them something that that they've got to buy, but you're actually saying you're providing something of value that's an offer that values what they do in their lives or can support what they want in their lives, it appears to attract people into it. So we do that through barbecues, we do that through chasing people down the street, like literally following people, random people that have children, because we work with children and families, but also in shopping centres, etc., and all other places. What I found, which I was incredibly surprised about when I came in, was also the amount of direct referrals we get from families. I was quite shocked by that. So we actually have people coming in. So in the Mount Druitt site, for instance, in Western Sydney, we have something like 70% of our families that are actually involved with the child protection system now, or have been, like their ex-guardianship or whatever, they're out of care. A high number of those families actually self-refer. So they actually tell us that they want support, even though they're connected or have had background with child protection, which is pretty amazing. And I experienced it myself when I was a family coach, where I took a phone call and a lady rang up and just said, hi, I'm interested in the model. I've looked at your website. I'm not quite sure about this. I want you to tell me more about it. You know, what's going to be good for me about this? And I explained it to her, and then I went and met her and spent some time with her. So we get a huge amount of self-referral. I don't completely understand why that is yet, but there's something about the way we look, the openness, I think the friendliness, the family-related nature of it, which makes people feel safe, that they can voluntarily come to us, that we don't have to chase them. So that's really, really interesting. Also, what we do in family engagement is we go through what I would call a type of assessment. We never use that word with families, but basically in identifying sharing families, we actually do quite a lot of engagement, which basically goes through an almost a 4-step process. So we're in a shopping centre, we've met someone that's interested in our offer. They've got something to share and they want to give something back to somebody else. That's our first meeting. The next thing that we do, which I think is quite unique, is we actually say, look, hey, if you're really, really interested, we want to get to know you and your family better. So we actually ask them to see if they're interested in inviting us over for dinner. And we actually sit in their homes, we buy their favourite meal. So you can put on a bit of weight when you're doing that. You know, it's often chicken and burgers and pizza. So that's the kind of stuff that we do because it's something special for the families. We take in a meal and we spend something like, so I've done a few of these, you're looking at it for about 2 hours over a lunch or a dinner, and you're with a family and their children and you're really hanging out with them. So we don't call it assessment, we call it you getting to know us and us getting to know you a bit better. But what we're also looking for is how family and children interact and how family talk about each other. We actually have this really cool snakes and ladders that we've created, which was one of the tools that was co-designed, and we ask family questions. So if you land on a snake, you get a certain thing. If you land on a ladder, you get a certain thing. And basically they ask things of both the adults in the family and the children. Things like, what's your favourite food? Or what is the best thing about your mum and dad? What have they done that's made you feel really good? What's something that you've done that's made a change in someone else's life? Where did you feel like, as a kid that you really helped somebody? So we go through basically a game and kids seem to love that. We read a book that takes them through a kid's version. We call it Huffs and Budges. Basically, it's birds talking about the sharing and seeking family experience. And also what we do is have a flip book, which is a bunch of pictures that takes people through the model. But mainly what we do is we eat food and we talk to people and you get to know them. So that's another way we engage. And I guess you would call that a type of assessment. Then what we do is if they're happy and we're happy, we actually go through what we call camp or a process of training. And that is that we spend time taking people, sharing families through the model. And then part of that is a second day where we actually go through family interactions. So we bring together those sharing families and all their children to basically play. So we have the circus and crazy stuff being done. We go on flying foxes and all those sorts of things with families and kids. And the whole idea is to see what the interaction is like, because what we want, apart from it being really fun for families and children and a good celebration, we want to see how families interact with each other, because we're expecting these families to actually engage with other families. How do they interact with children when they're under a little bit of stress? How do they work with their children? How do they work with other families? So I think family engagement is a really key component, which we're refining, but we seem to have something about it that's working really well at the moment with families. So that's one key component. We also have what we call a link-up map, which is also about engaging, but is much more about what the sharing family does with a seeking family. Having said that, I think as someone that is a professional that's not a family, that's worked in a different system, this is really useful for me as well, as a person working with other people. So basically the stages that they go through is 3 key stages about making behaviour change. The first one, which is on the left-hand side, is really about building rapport and building relationships. It's about the first connection. And what I found amazing about this is that as a coach, when I was playing that role, I actually got to see some really experienced sharing families do it like this. Like they just know how to connect with somebody else. It's an amazing skill to have that I think is really, really useful for professionals, but how you connect with somebody. And even in the most difficult situations, there are ways to be able to do that. So that's really useful, I think, building a relationship. Secondly, once you've got a level of trust, it is about going to that next step and looking at behaviour change. So just say, like we saw Jess and Bo in that film, one of the big issues for her was really about how do you interact with your child? You know, how do you go out there? Because she was shy, scared of what people thought, she didn't know how to play with her child in the same way that Helza and her child knew how to do that. So it was about going to the park together, spending that time hanging out and actually watching together how you do those things together. So that's doing it together. Finally, a big part of what a sharing family does is around doing without. So this is about providing an opportunity for seeking families to develop their own strengths and skills. For example, and sharing families are really, really creative in the way they do this with seeking families. But for instance, we had one person that was incredibly socially isolated. She basically didn't leave her house. She couldn't even visit her friend that was across the road, basically. The sharing family got her into workshops and actually got her into TAFE eventually. But what she did was that she would do things like, she would actually get the woman to actually go into training and go to a TAFE and did that with her for a while. But then in the end, what she did is that she would suddenly pull out and say, oh, unfortunately, I'm not able to come to that now, but I'm going to ring you after this is done and let me know how it all goes. So it's about steadily pulling back, and part of that is about not building, dependence on somebody. That's part of it, but the other part is building someone's own capacity to be able to do that and to respond. We don't have the restrictions around dependence building that a lot of other services do, where you've got restrictions on how often you can see a client, then you've got to disconnect. Our families do connect afterwards, but we do want seeking families to actually be able to do that on their own. So why I think this is particularly good for engagement is it's useful for individual practices that any provider might want to do. It's no different to how a worker might want to engage somebody. You can do it through having some rapport, doing some things with, and doing some of those things without. You might just have to do it a lot quicker, depending on the services that you're providing. So that's another way that I think is an important way of thinking about engagement. So this is a little bit of a confusing diagram, but what I want to do is really to take you through the red spots. The red spots is where the coach is directly involved in things. So I just want to take you through the quick steps of the role that we play. So basically, the number one red spot, so we've got a seeking family line, a sharing family line, and a family coach line. The first spot is us meeting a seeking family. I had the opportunity to do that, which was wonderful. So I got the self-referral and then I was able to go out and do a visit. What we do is we have a series of profiles of sharing families. Like it actually explains who they are, how many children they've got, what means something to them, what they've been through, what's their tough time, what was their experience. We give those at least 2 or 3 of those profiles to a seeking family and we go, which one would you like? Which one resonates with you? And often it can be about the previous experience of a sharing family, but also about the type of children involved. So often a lot of families want someone to connect with which has got similar type of children, similar age, similar experience. So that's the first time a coach is involved. Then what we do is we go to a meet and greet, and that's where we bring together all of those lines, seeking, sharing and us, and we will either go do that at a seeking family's home, or we'll go to a restaurant or a cafe. I'll shout everybody and then we'll actually meet and greet. And this is where you really get to see sharing families work, and this is where you really get to experience how non-important you are as a professional in this. So I really noticed that in a major way, where I was trying to kind of like talk and no one cared about what I was saying. And I just thought, now I get it. This is what it means. Okay, see you later. I'm going now. So that's the meet and greet process. And they stay together and they hang out together for longer and connect. Then what we do is we hang out with sharing families on the purple line. That's the third dot. We basically provide coaching services or coaching support to sharing families for 2 hours a week. So it's almost like a form of supervision where you have all the families sitting around and you're sitting there as the coach and you go through every one of their link-ups. So how is blah blah family going? The Smiths. Okay, you're with them for 5 weeks already. You've only got 10 weeks with them and you're still not connecting properly. What is it that we need to do differently? Oh, okay. Oh, your family's got child protection intervention and you're not getting a lot of support from the case manager there. Okay, we'll intervene. So basically what we do is we ask questions, we observe, we support, and where required we intervene. And sometimes that can be required, particularly around referrals, and where you're trying to manage a very, very complex link-up or connection between two families. So that's coaching. When they can't come to that, for the 2 hours, we do phone coaching. So it basically works like a very, very regular type of supervision that you'd have with your staff member. Then what we do is we have a check-in. So for example, and this is what I did, at 2 weeks' time I called up the family that I was involved with and I said, hey, I've heard really positive things from the sharing family, but I just want you to feel okay about letting me know, is there anything that's a problem here? Is there anything you'd like to change in that? And luckily it was going really well, but that's a way of providing some kind of separate observation of what's going on between that family interaction. And then finally what we do is we measure the changes. So the bubbles that I showed you before and the thermometer, the happy and sad faces, we do that at 5 weeks. So we measure it right at the beginning, at the meet and greet. We do it 5 weeks and then we do it at 10, 20 and 30 weeks. And that's when we really understand and can work with families to say, hey, you're getting this place, how do we go to this place? Or we're not seeing really much change at all. What direction do we need to do in terms of changing our practice? So that's really the role of the professional. And I have to say, look, I haven't worked in direct child protection services as a social worker, but I've worked in residential care, and that's a fairly difficult area to work in. I reckon this is one of the most complex positions to be in, is providing this coaching role. Because you're not there as a person that can see what's going on. You've actually got to step back and through questions, observations, talking to people, understand what's really going on with families. So the skill is understanding the questions to ask. The skill is understanding what a family tells you and making an interpretation of that. So that's, I think, one of the most amazing things about the role. So I do want to talk a little bit about children. Children are a big part of what we do. And in fact, we're a universal service, but we do work with families with children. So they can make big changes in what we do, and we wanted to better understand that. We're not great at this work, we're getting better, and we're learning more and more about the value of what children do in this type of work. So to understand that, what did we do? Basically, we spent time. We went through the similar co-design processes that I said before, observation, hanging out with kids, etc. And we wanted to learn from them. What is it that's important to you about this work? As a sharing family that hangs out with other kids and other adults, what is useful for you about this? What do you need that's different? And we came up with 4 key learnings. The first thing that was really important to children and young people was to have choice. So they also wanted to have choice about what a link-up looked like. Where you hang out with a family. And you can do that. So for example, one way you could do that is, hey Johnny, the next link-up that we have, where do you think it should be? You know, we hung out there and Bobby from the Seeking family found that really difficult. Is there something else we could do? So they can be involved in making choice that can benefit others. Secondly, we found that link-ups do require levels of support. So we provide a family coach role and coaching sessions, particularly for adults. That is the opportunity to debrief. It is the opportunity to go, oh, I noticed something. That was really tough. What can I do? Or that made me feel something different. I want to talk a bit about that. We provide those debrief opportunities. What could we do that could support that for children? So we began a role called a kids coach role. So we've got a family coach role and a kids coach role. And we began to look at what the possibility of that was. Some of the interesting challenges we face, and a lot of educators would understand this straight away, is that when you have diverse children in one room, how can you really provide things that are both beneficial for every single child there, but support for different types of children? Actually quite difficult to do. So that was an important learning for us. What we're developing now is how we can individually work with children who are either guiding link-ups or may have seen something that can be a bit harder. Because, you know, children see things that can be hard too in link-ups, you know, when they're working with seeking families that have had a tough life, or, you know, don't know how to clean their house really well. They're learning, they're getting better at that. All of that can be very, very different from a child's experience. So we need to provide the opportunity for the child to debrief. We need to provide the opportunity for them to give advice on what needs to occur next and to support them through that process. Thirdly, and I think this is a really important one, children can be wonderful role models, and they can be wonderful role models for other children as well as adults. And we see it all the time. We don't name it that all the time, but we see kids do it all the time. So, you know, one example, we had a child called Sam. He was kind of like a popular sharing family kid. And he used that to be able to help other kids try something a bit different because they wanted to get to know him because he was a bit cool. So it was kind of turning that coolness factor into something really useful around change. Kids do that anyway a lot of the time. Also, of course, you saw Jess and Beau. That baby and toddler is playing a role too. You know, Helza was connecting with her child and having that connection and that, you know, that relationship. That child is playing a role every time that they create a dynamic with their parent, which was being observed by that other adult. So role modelling is a key factor of what children can do. Finally, what we want to do is to allow play to occur. You would have seen, and there's been lots of kind of narrative and discourse around changes in adult behaviour of how we treat children and play. Apart from the fact that we've got much more digital things that occur for children now that are used, there can be a real challenge, I think, between the mix of being what people have termed, I don't know what you call it here, a helicopter parent, versus letting your child just go completely out there and wild. And I have to say, I see more of the helicopter parenting, and even as a child, and I'm 41 now, so it's not that long ago, is it? I was actually allowed to run away all day. And even now, that's not happening in the same way for a lot of children. So I'd come back for dinner. That's just not happening. So what we want to be able to do is to try to create free play. So we're really working on how we can create environments where free play, that is safe, but also incredibly fun and adventurous and gives a child a chance to explore their body and how they use it. We want to be able to build that more into our program. So we're really, really working on that at the moment. So that's children and the importance of children in our model. And look, finally, I won't be spending a lot of time on this, but I do want to talk about this because I think it's an essential part of our model. We really want to do more work around engaging Aboriginal people, so Indigenous Australians. We're not doing too badly. So we've got Aboriginal seeking families that have been able to create change in their lives, and that's been incredibly positive. But we wanted to do something different. So what we decided to do was a report and a sense of learning from Aboriginal community. So basically, we went out there and we spent time with Aboriginal families that have been involved with our program, Aboriginal families that have never had any contact with our program, and services that work with Aboriginal people. And we asked them the questions: what's important to you? What do you think of F by F? Did it make a difference to you? What would make it better for you? to services. What do you think Aboriginal people need in order to be able to get something better, a better offer from this program? And what we found, as you would probably imagine, is that we have very, very diverse views around that. So like all populations, Aboriginal people are not homogenous. They're incredibly diverse. So what were some of the comments we got back? There were some families that said, look, I would find this very, very difficult if I had to be linked with an Aboriginal sharing family. And that's because it's easier to identify who I am, and it's difficult to share my story because everybody knows who you are. And that is absolutely true in Australia. I don't know what it's like here for Indigenous people here with the population. In South Australia in particular, it's full on. So basically I can go into a service, and I'm not Indigenous Nation, I can go into a service, somebody will probably know me. And so for instance, I rocked up to a recruitment where I thought, oh, this is really interesting. My auntie, my cousin, and my family's best friend were there. So there is no way of getting away with it. So within our communities, everybody knows you in some way. That is both a gift and can be very difficult if you want to be anonymous in service delivery. Others said, hey, there is no way we're going to come to your program unless you've got an Aboriginal face. Why isn't this for Aboriginal people only? Why is it a universal service? We need it for Aboriginal people. It should only be for Aboriginal people. Services said, you need to have more products that actually have Indigenous kind of look to them. You need to be getting out there with an Aboriginal staff member. Why haven't you got one yet? We also heard from them about their views about what it means to make change in people's lives, and particularly Aboriginal community lives. And because the report anonymised people, they were very, very open about that. Some could see the hope in what it meant to work with Indigenous communities. Others found it very, very difficult. So they gave examples of the families that they work with who are constantly struggling day to day. The biggest challenge that they had was just having their house clean and a big bin filled up with rubbish every week, and to ensure that that occurred. Anything more than that, they couldn't see was possible. So what we found out of all of this is that we needed to rethink a little bit about what we're doing. We do need to build in stronger issues around how and things around building our community engagement with Aboriginal families. We do need to give choice. We don't need to have all Aboriginal sharing families for Aboriginal seeking families all the time. And in fact, it appears that not everybody would want that. We'd want to give Aboriginal people choice. We've actually built in an Aboriginal connector role and in fact employed somebody. And did it actually literally make a difference? Yes, it did. Basically the second day, we attracted more people. So obviously something that's well known by the Aboriginal community instantly worked, and she's actually fabulous. So that's been really good. And what we also found was that through this kind of work, we can begin to make incremental changes to the things that we can do. We want families to thrive. We don't just want them to get by. So one of the key things that we're working on is how do we hold, and this is a really careful balance that we've got to provide here for all families, but also more, really importantly Aboriginal families, both the ability to see what people's lives are like and what colonisation has done to people and how they experience that, and my own family's experienced that, but also want more for people. So that's the kind of the balance that we're holding. We really want to aim a bit higher, and I certainly do. What would it mean to have a lot of these families get out of it and actually have pride about what they do, walk tall, proud about their heritage and who they are? We want that more, and anything that we can do with this program to do that, we're going to be trying to do that for Aboriginal families. So finally, what I want to do is just kind of give a very, very brief summary of what I've just spoken about and to talk a bit about what I think are opportunities. So I took you through very, very briefly the mission of Taxi and what we're trying to achieve, and a bit about some of the other solution weavers. I took you through a bit about distribution and scaling of the program and what that looks like, the challenges, what we're considering and thinking about, and also what it means to work with the public sector, which can be incredibly beneficial, I think, for both. And then, of course, being a lab that's running a social service, which is amazingly challenging and a wonderful experience to be in. So that's really broadly what I talked about, and then we dove into the model and spent some time swimming around in there and looking at the detail of that. And finally, what are some of the bigger picture opportunities? we think that family by family can be a lever for some bigger things. So I just want to take you through those 4 steps that we think are going to be useful. First of all, what would it mean if the sharing families and the families we work with could actually build the capacity of the system themselves? So some of the things we're just exploring right now is sharing families and what it could look like for them to build the practice capacity of social workers in child protection. What is it that they can teach a social worker about engagement, connection, what it means to be a family? So that's one thing we think family by family can help us to, influence broader system change in terms of social work and other practice. How can we use the family by family model as a lever for other products that we can create? So Carolyn Curtis, the social worker who's now our CEO, often talks about what it could look like if we had a 2-year link-up. What if a sharing and seeking family hung out for 2 years? And what if that seeking family could have been in the child protection system? The amount of, if we think about it as a cost benefit, when you have a child in care, that is thousands and thousands of dollars. The difference that we could make for something like that could be amazing for a family. We're just thinking about that and throwing around those ideas with people. How could we also apply the F by F method? So the design process, the way in which we work with children and young people, the way in which we work with families, how could we apply that in different areas of work? So for instance, things that we're really interested in is particularly in areas like disability. What would a model like this look like if it was transferable into the disability sector for people with disabilities? This is one in particular that I'm particularly passionate about. We've got a major reform going on called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, where we are actually moving to individual people being the buyers of their services. What opportunities can that provide to do something like this? I don't know, but it's an interesting opportunity. And finally, through Taxi's learning through this solution and the other work that they're doing with people and organisations, in what way can we use this to make big, broader systems change? We are beginning to do some of this work in how we take big ideas to systems to look at big changes, but we are open and think there's lots of opportunity to use family by family to think about this in a much bigger way. So changing housing systems or other things that families interact with that could make a profound difference. So that's some of the bigger picture. So finally, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that was useful for all of you tonight. Thanks.
So I don't think we're going to use these because you gave such a wonderful presentation and could talk for hours, and I just wanted to give folks a chance to ask a couple of questions. I have like 10,000, but I'll have dinner with her later. So why don't you guys throw out some questions, please? Yes.
Hi, thanks a lot. So I'm really impressed with your level of engagement and how profound it really is. But how did you manage, or did you encounter circumstances where people asked for things that you couldn't deliver, that were outside your planning level or scope or whatever?
Absolutely. So I think.
Can I just check? Can you guys hear the question on the for the filming? Could you hear it for the filming? No. So I'm just going to repeat it really quickly. So what did you do when you found that you were people had needs that were beyond your current funding?
Yes, I can answer that in 2 different levels. So I guess where we have people that want to refer and they don't understand the limits of what we can do, we've been really straightforward with them about that. So basically we just say we can't do it. So we do have a certain funding that's for certain areas, and there's a limit to it. The reason why there's a limit is because sharing families, we try to do it in a geographical way, and the reason we do that is because sharing families are expected to travel. So we have to limit the way in which we scope the expansion of that work, otherwise that becomes hard. But I think you might have also been asking about families and when they ask us of things that we can't do. Yeah. Look, I think that in family practice and in professional practice with people, the most important thing is honesty around those sorts of things. It's having the courage to be able to be straight with people. And that's basically what you do. So you have the conversation with people. So there have definitely been times when people have said, oh, I want this or I want that. Sharing and seeking. Why can't we as a sharing family do blah? Why, as a seeking family, I really want you to change this. it's about being honest with people. And when you do that, people can get angry at you, particularly in child protection areas. They can get very grumpy with you about that, but they respect it if you're honest. If you're not honest and you're not straight, that's when you begin to run into problems. Yeah.
Another question? Yes.
My question is around how do you measure the KPIs for families that just graduated from the program after the 10 weeks or the 30 weeks?
Yep.
So essentially, how do you measure success generally in the program?
Yeah. Thank you. A really important point. So as I said, we did an evaluation in 2011. We're doing a second evaluation. So the measurements at 5, 10, 20 and 30 weeks show us the behaviour change that occurs up until the end of a link-up. I think what you're asking is, how do you know beyond that? We are going through an evaluation process. So basically we will be asking families that have been through our program, how did you experience this? And we'll be wanting to understand how they're going right now. Other things that we're doing is that we actually will be comparing some of that with de-identified data. So we will be comparing some of the outcomes of families and what they've been through with a similar cohort that have not actually had the same program. So we're trying as best we can to have some level of comparison. So that's how we're going to be able to do it. Would it be good to be able to build it more fundamentally in the system? Yes, it would, to be able to understand that over a longer time. We haven't done that yet. Yep.
Yes. There's a microphone. That'd be great. Thank you.
What has happened, or has this happened, to seeking families that you've had to ask to leave the program? Or what do you do with those families that aren't a good fit and you find out midstream or late in the game?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Can I say that we haven't generally ran into that problem. We've got very few link-ups that haven't gone to a certain place. Where it has occurred, it's often where the issues that a seeking family is going through, that they're facing, means that they're not ready for change in their lives. So if I can give an example, where we've had families that were trying to give up drug use, that was actually highly detrimental drug use, and haven't been able to do that, or where they're living in domestic violence and haven't been able to get out of that, if they're not willing to make those changes, that's when it has occurred. What we try to do is to do everything we can to stop that from happening. So what are some of the things we've attempted if we've seen something a bit rocky? A coach will try to intervene and think about the link-up and how we might modify and change what we're doing. If a link-up's not working between a sharing family and a seeking family, we do change it sometimes. So we'll actually say, look, this sharing family, not connecting, no, if you want to be able to leave, that's fine, that's obviously your choice. What if we gave you another family to work with? So we'll definitely use that as well. Where seeking families still choose to leave, what we decide to say, and we always say this, is we're open to people returning. So basically, if people want to leave for a period of time, are not ready to make change and want to come back, we are really open to that as well. Can I also say, and this is because your questions kind of sparks that this is quite useful, you know, sharing and seeking families are not a completely separate group of people. In fact, sharing families can become seeking families. As we all do, we all go through hard times, don't we? You know, you're not always in this good space all the time. So what we also offer is that sharing families can be a seeking family for a period of time, and that's part of how we can support them back into sharing again. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I'm just going to take one more question. Anyway, yeah.
So I guess this relates to the question about KPIs, which made me laugh a little bit, because I'm learning about social innovation impact and measurement and how to measure those things. And I'm curious, what are some of the overarching outcomes that you can sort of pitch to governments or other funders of your program to really, what are those outcomes that you can measure to sort of, what do you use as your overarching outcomes?
So one of the pitches that we did make was, and I kind of referred to it earlier on, was about children in care. So what we were trying to pitch was that if we could do this kind of work with families and potentially stop children returning into care, the kind of savings that we required. So that's one big one that we can do. Another one, which you would have seen Suhit's mention on the actual film, was about cost effectiveness. So because we are working through volunteers who do get a reimbursement, but they're not paid a wage, they're not social workers, and we don't treat them as such, we can actually make this a cost-effective model when you scale it in a big way. So when we talk about scale in terms of the program, that would be a key manager up the top. I'm the director up here. 2 to 6 sharing family coaches that sit underneath, and each of them having 15 sharing families, and each of those sharing families at any given time having 1 to 3 different families that they work with. So if you get that model, particularly up to 6 coaches with the numbers of families underneath, you can actually be quite cost effective. Yeah, I hope that answers that question. Yeah.
So Dana, a couple of things. If you followed me at the mall and asked if to buy me dinner, I would so go with you, right? Because look, she's like so engaging and so warm, and I just know that I would be in really good hands, and plus I like food a lot, so that would all be good. I've been thinking about, when you're talking about, we talk a lot about scale out, right? How do we get this into different geographic areas? And I like what you said at the end about, scaling, what we call scaling up, right? So I'm thinking families in grief, right? Families who've just lost someone. And I do think there's actually even opportunities for all of us to think about, is there a fee-for-service kind of model here that you would think about as well at different stages? Because I agree with you, at certain points, not alone in my life, but today I've been either a sharing or seeking family, right? So I think that's really something to think about. I'd be happy to chat with you more about that. And I love even the language. It's so non-judgmental, sharing and seeking. I mean, right? It's really quite profound. Finally, I just want to say that you have been so open and so giving, and obviously you're so reflective through this process. We completely appreciate that and love that you have been so kind with your time and sharing your wisdom with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's really wonderful.
Thank you.
And the final thing is I just wanted to remind you again that this is part of Social Innovation Canada series of events. Learn more by looking at the SIG website, sigeneration.ca. And I'm hoping you can stick around for a few minutes and answer some more questions from some folks if they have them. And thank you all very much for coming. Have a great night.